Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Geopolitical Changes and the Global Security Architecture. Where are we heading? My name is Jen Malott from Cambridge University Press, and before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've all joined in listen-only mode. However, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the Q&A box. You can send your questions at any time during the discussion. They'll be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of today's event. If we're unable to get through all the questions, additional comments can be included in a Q&A document that we can send around with the recording later this week. If you experience any technical difficulties, please put that in the Q&A box as well, and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. In the unlikely event we have any major technical issues, we can message the audience and restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 1 hour. And to get everything started, I'm delighted to turn things over to Ingrid Brunk, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you so much, Jen, and welcome to Geopolitical Changes and the Global Security Architecture. This is a webinar sponsored by the American Journal of International Law. I am the co-editor-in-chief of the American Journal of International Law, along with Monica Hakimi. We have 4 absolutely incredible panelists today, and time permits me to only provide the briefest of introductions, but I encourage you to read their work and follow them on social media. Our first panelist is Ona Hathaway, the Gerard C. and Bernice Latrobe Smith Professor of International Law at Yale Law School. She is also the Professor of International Law and Area Studies at the Macmillan Center, and as well as serving as a professor in the Political Science Department. She is an expert on all things international law, including the use of force and international criminal accountability mechanisms. Professor Post is an associate professor at the University of Chicago and a fellow of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. His research, writing, and teaching focus on international politics. Stephen Hill has served as the Director for Global Criminal Justice and Multilateral Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council. He has also served as the Chief Legal Advisor for NATO. He is currently Executive Secretary of the International Institute for Justice and Rule of Law. Tanisha Faisal is a professor of political science at the University of Minnesota. Her research and teaching focus on sovereignty, international law, medical care in conflict zones, and armed conflict. She currently serves as an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. So welcome to all of you, both audience members and panelists. Our topic is whether and how Russia's invasion of Ukraine has changed the global security architecture and what we expect it to look like going forward. So I'm going to take a brief minute and have us think back to the way the global security architecture and the international order looked in another before time. And that before time would be before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2020. Late 2019, I think, could be characterized by a flat or declining economic power of China, both before and during COVID, a growing alliance between China and Russia, formalized through a no limits agreement that was put in place just before the invasion began, an increasing competition and rivalry between China and the United States, a general but somewhat contested decline after World War II of interstate war, with the US war in Afghanistan perhaps serving as an important counterexample, uses of force by the West, in particular by the United States, that violated Article 2.4 of the UN Charter and sidelined the UN Security Council, a stagnant international criminal court, coupled with some domestic prosecutions under universal jurisdiction of war criminals, especially Syrian war criminals in Germany, concerns about trade security, and a displacement of global free trade narratives and a rise of bilateral or regional free trade agreements, assaults on democracy, creating problems for the United States, a growth in unilateral, and by that I mean non-UN authorized sanctions as a solution to a host of global problems ranging from human rights to nuclear ambitions, a failure to deal adequately with problems such as migration, wealth inequality, and climate change at the global level. Most of the panel, I think the panelists and probably most of the audience might have a slightly different list, but that I think is a snapshot that captures a lot of what most people would say was happening in 2019. So I want to turn to the panelists first to focus on the kind of the global state of play before February 2022, and then most of the rest of the webinar will ask what has changed or what is going to be different going forward. I would like the panelists to speak in the order in which I introduced them, which would put Ona Hathaway speaking first. Welcome, Ona.
Thank you so much. Thank you for convening us. It's so great to be here with such a wonderful group of discussants to talk about this important topic. So, I mean, you raised a lot of important points, and I think, I think I agree with most of them. A couple I might highlight, just to pull out a couple since there's so much on the table. One is what you highlighted is the decline of interstate war, which is, I think, an important fact of the post-UN order compared to kind of pre-1945. We've had a significant decline in wars between states, obviously concomitant rise of wars within states, which is a kind of interesting phenomenon, and transition from wars, fewer wars between states, which are of course prohibited by the UN Charter, but a rise of civil wars and interstate wars at the same time. And I think a growing phenomenon of kind of unclear the extent to which the US was willing to continue to be the key player in supporting the prohibition on war. I think you highlighted importantly the ways in which the United States has kind of sometimes played fast and loose with the rules, in particular expanding self-defense doctrine in ways that sort of test the limits of Article 51 through really kind of pushing this idea of unable, unwilling as a sort of a proper interpretation of Article 51, which is not widely accepted, and using that as a basis for using force around the world. And I think raising real questions about, the degree of commitment of the United States to the prohibition on war, which was really essential to the creation of the modern international order. And I won't go into what has happened as a result of the war, because I think in a way the sort of the war in Ukraine kind of casts that history into stark relief, and I'm sure we'll get to that. And the second sort of trend that I think is important and kind of sets the stage for the war is the growing reliance on sanctions as a tool and technique for enforcement of international law. And once war was outlawed first in the Calabrean Pact and then reinforced in the Charter, there had to be another way of enforcing international law, and tools of sanctions, economic sanctions, have been kind of the key technique that states have developed over time. And the US has really innovated new tools like secondary sanctions and increasing use of sanctions and sort of ways of magnifying the power of the dollar as a reserve currency of choice as a way to enforce international law. And that, again, has kind of become both being tested and I think reinforced by the current conflict. So I'll stop there because we have a lot more to talk about.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Paul?
Great. Well, I would just echo the thanks for convening this panel. I'm excited to be part of this. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the conversation goes today. And for me, when thinking about this question, especially the broader question of how has the international system changed, how has the international order changed because of this war, I love this idea of kind of situating things pre-February 24th, 2022. And for me, the way to think about it is I thought of a variety of statements that I might have heard someone say prior to that time. And these would have been statements like, NATO is weak. Why would someone like Finland ever need to join it, right? Moreover, NATO is irrelevant. Major war in Europe, that's never going to happen again, right? The US lacks credibility. Years of investment of Afghanistan led to nothing. Summit of democracy, that was a complete joke, right? These would be things you would hear. Russia is 100 feet tall. Europe is so dependent on it. Putin, he's a geopolitical mastermind, right? These are other things you would expect to hear. The EU has no future, right? Brexit shows that states are just not going to want to work within the EU. China is the future. Europe is so dependent, and they're okay being dependent on China. And despite the hiccups of COVID, it really shows the US and the liberal international order that was led by the US, that's going to be the thing of the past. Countries are going to want to work with China. That's, of course, where things are going to go. And then economic sanctions, yeah, maybe that helped out with, turns out maybe that did prevent Iraq from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. But by and large, sanctions are just not something that are really useful. They're just used as an instrument when you don't know what else to do, right? So I think these are all statements that in my mind, I could very much imagine, and in fact, didn't even need to imagine. I imagine you could find very easily people making statements like this, prominent individuals, everybody from policymakers to scholars, making statements like this prior to February of this year. And of course, the whole point is to set up, which I think something we're going to talk about today, is how I think every one of these statements we now have to rethink. And to me, that really points to how this war is going to have, and is indeed having, significant impact on the international order. So I'll stop there for right now to hear what the rest of my colleagues have to say, but that's how I think about the pre-February 22 situation.
Thank you so much, Paul. Steve?
Okay, thanks very much, Ingrid, and congratulations for convening this panel. I think it's, I'm also really looking forward to it. I think the role of the American Journal of International Law in promoting dialogue in this space is really important. Congratulations on the new edition that's come out. I'm really looking forward to reading not only your intro article with Monica, but also all of the different really interesting pieces. So let me just drill down. I mean, I totally agree with the way that Paul and Ona have just framed this. Let me just drill down on three areas that I've kind of been working in. First, the United Nations, second, transatlantic relations, and then third, international criminal justice. I'm not sure if our comparison date here is right before February 24th of this year, or if 2019. If we're talking about 2019, I mean, we were just at the low point of all of those areas, and not just as far as the United States is concerned, but probably in terms of the hopes and aspirations of the international community. You really had the sense that, the UN was not the place that a lot of states were looking to be able to make progress on some of the largest challenges facing humanity. If you look at progress in lots of areas that was done in sort of ad hoc international formats that were sort of maybe lightly associated with the UN, but probably not at the core of the UN, like maybe I think many UN supporters would appreciate. You had a high degree of deadlock on the UN Security Council that was thanks to growing problems between great powers, and I don't think we're going to see that there's an undoing of that deadlock now. In fact, it's the contrary, but it's very interesting to think about how that deadlock actually plays out. Probably in a more positive way at the moment. Moving on to transatlantic relations, you mentioned, of course, Paul, NATO, the European Union. There's a little bit of a continuum here. It's not as if 2014 was also an important wake-up call year for transatlantic relations, but in many ways, even with 2014 and Russia's illegal invasion of Crimea, you still had such large difficulties in terms of the issue of burden sharing. Could European countries take on more role in defense spending? What is the respective kind of weight that the US in terms of Europe's defense and European countries themselves? And then as far as the European Union is concerned, I would say a high degree of lack of consensus around a lot of the issues about energy security, the European Union's very role in kind of European security. And then thirdly, in the field of international criminal justice, I'll just wrap it here. I mean, obviously, it was at a real low point in terms of the US relationship with international criminal institutions. That was the period when we had, President Trump's really wrong executive order trying to sanction the ICC prosecutor and various ICC officials. Even with amongst ICC supporters, there was a high degree of frustration that the court really hadn't been able to kind of produce much. Frustration that many of the investigations weren't perceived to be going anywhere or were very difficult to deal with. And I think that's maybe the snapshot there. So I'll end on that point. Thank you, Ingrid.
Thank you, Steve. Nisha?
Thanks, Ingrid. Thanks for having me and for convening this panel. It's already a really great conversation. And like others, I really enjoy this question, this request to kind of look back, especially at a time when people have been saying since COVID started that time is flat. It's, I think, really easy to forget what things were like a number of months ago. I mean, I would say that I think that, you know, in early 2022, a lot of us were still really focused on COVID and particularly the global response to the pandemic, the poor global response to the pandemic. And I see that as pretty revelatory, the nature of the global response in some of the same ways that the international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been revelatory as well, because it's put into really stark relief some of the inherent weaknesses, sometimes by design, of major international organizations. It has also made very clear how much states care about their sovereignty. And I do think that COVID also really demonstrates in interesting ways China's growing power in the international system, not just vis-a-vis organizations like the World Health Organization, but also in the global South in particular, you know, through its mask diplomacy, through its vaccine diplomacy, a lot of which was navigated through existing pathways that had been created by the Belt and Road Initiative. But I also think that COVID revealed some important weaknesses in China, for example. And not only does China have a lot of challenges in managing its image abroad as a result of the pandemic, but is also facing real challenges in managing COVID at home. And the very weak response alongside a series of domestic upheavals in the United States, both of which I think raise real questions about the future role for both the US and China in their world and their standing in global politics relative to each other, but just in general as well. So I think it shines a light on possible shifts in power, but also domestic issues and major powers. But when we turn to questions of global security, I think, you know, here I might have a slightly different take than Ona, for example, because I think that things seem stable, but they're also kind of not so stable. It really depends on what your perspective is. You know, I know that there's a lot of people out there who make the argument that war is in decline, but I would push back against this argument. In fact, Paul and I have pushed back against this argument in writing. I mean, I agree with Ona that most of the wars have been civil wars more recently, but a lot of those civil wars have been very internationalized. And I would argue that people who make the claim that war is in decline are often, there are some fundamental empirical errors that really underlie that claim that I can talk about if you want. But I do think that interstate war was much more in decline. You can make that argument much more plausibly for interstate war than you can for civil war. But we should talk about, I hope we will, Crimea in 2014, which is an interesting case because Russia is really trying to avoid a major war while at the same time trying to make the annexation seem legal. And then the other thing the last thing I'll say is that I think that, you know, in early 2022, Ukraine and Ukrainians did expect this attack from Russia, and they've been preparing for it since 2014, but it caught the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, by surprise.
Terrific. Wow, there's just so much. We could just go off on Crimea and what was Europe and Germany, what were they thinking? Anyway, but that might send us down a rabbit hole. I want to start maybe where we just concluded, and that is with the future of these norms and laws that prevent both war and territorial conquest. For the international lawyers in the audience, will know these are two different somewhat different prohibitions that have somewhat different historical pedigree. And one of the potential ways that the war in Ukraine differs from prior armed conflicts, and certainly from the civil wars that you just described. And Tanisha, I know you've written about this, that we're seeing a war for territorial conquest that looks anachronistic. It seems like something 19th century. And so my question is, I see that as a very different kind of armed conflict than the armed conflicts we've seen, most of the armed conflicts we've seen since World War II. Do you agree with that assessment? You've answered that a little bit, but what does this mean going forward? Or can we expect a lot more wars of territorial acquisition? Can we expect countries to look at their neighbors and think, wow, there's some territory there that looks pretty attractive to me? Do you see that in the future or not? And I'll start with you, Nisha.
So I think, for me, in a lot of ways, this is sort of the question. And I think it's the question of what makes this war different and what the consequences of that are is also really important when thinking about global response to Russia's invasion, especially response from the global South, because I think a lot of people in the global South were rightly saying they really had a point in saying, why is everybody so upset about this war? There have been wars going on for decades in Yemen and Syria, more recently in Tigray. So why are these wars getting so much less attention than this war in Ukraine? And we shouldn't ignore the potential role of race here in responding to that question. But I do think that the answer has very much to do with international law. And this is not to justify the distribution of attention, but to explain it, because of course Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a clear violation of international law and its territorial aims. And again, I think it's interesting to compare it to 2014, right, where Russia also has territorial aims, but is trying to hide its role with the so-called little green men. And in this war, we're also observing, we should talk not just about laws of war governing the resort to force, but also international humanitarian law, which has been being violated left and right in this war as well. But in terms of what happens next, I think what happens next depends on what happens next, in the sense that this is a violation of law and norms. But when we think about the strength of norms, we can think about, and law also, we can think about how you measure that can be very challenging. Is a law or a norm strong because no one's violating it? Well, it kind of depends on why no one's violating it. Is no one violating it because no one wants to violate it? Or is no one violating it because they're actually constrained by the norm or the law? And so the response to the violation is what matters greatly. And here, I think it's really interesting to compare the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, not only to the 2004 annexation and invasion of Crimea, but also to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, right? Where you have, in some ways, a pretty analogous situation, but of course, Russia and Iraq are not the same countries as invaders. And so I think that everybody's sort of stepping very carefully, which is probably the right thing to do. And what will happen next, it really very much depends on how steady the hold is against Russia's invasion, and really speaks to also, I think, issues around war termination and what kinds of concessions, not only Ukraine, but also other states in the world are willing to push for and make.
Terrific. It's interesting to note, although there has been a different response, obviously, to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, there have also been very notable instances where countries have refused to condemn or have abstained from the UN General Assembly vote. So we'll come back to this. Are we seeing just a bifurcation of the global legal order? I want to come back to that when we talk about multilateral institutions. But first, Ona, I really have to get you into the conversation here. Ona, for those of you who don't know, has written a major book with Scott Shapiro on the way historical efforts to outlaw war through international law. So I'll turn it over to you to take up this topic, whether this war is different, and if so, does that matter going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question to ask, and I think it's similar in some ways and different in others. And I think that your piece with Monica, I think, highlights some really important elements of distinction that are part of the reason for the robust response that we see in the international community to this, that we haven't seen, for instance, to violations through the stretching of Article 51 self-defense, which I mentioned earlier, which many of us regard as testing, if not breaking, the Article 2.4 prohibition on use of force. Why hasn't that received the same kind of response that, for instance, this has received? And I think part of the reason for that is a recognition. Every state can kind of see that its own interests are at issue here, and that if this kind of global conquest stands, that their own hold on their own sovereignty is at risk. And so, not just Ukraine's neighbors that see that, but that states around the world see this fear. This is part of the question of how the global community responds to the use of force by Russia in Ukraine. Has lessons. The part of the audience for that response is China, which is eyeing the global response, to see what kind of reaction there might be to an invasion of Taiwan. And many people have looked at this and said, although it does mean that the West is tied up, and so it might make it in some ways a more attractive time for China to invade Taiwan. The robust response kind of took China by surprise, and the kind of cost of a war of conquest of this kind now is much more obvious than it was before. And I think that it could have gone a different direction. I mean, I think, running the counterfactual of what might have happened if the US hadn't been very quick to respond to the Russian invasion and kind of bringing together the West in you had to kind of create this ad hoc system for responding, because of course you couldn't rely on the Security Council and mandatory sanctions through the Security Council. It had to be done through kind of building an ad hoc coalition, obviously building off of the beginnings of that through the response to the invasion of Crimea, which, eventually there was a robust sanctions response. It took some time to get going because, of course, again, you couldn't rely on the Security Council, and that coalition was eventually built, and they're kind of building on that tool here. But I do think that, part of what I see here, initially after the invasion happened, there was this moment when it could have been the beginning of the end of the modern international order. I think had there not been a robust international response, I think we would have probably, there was some initial sort of declarations that the UN is dead and, the charter prohibitions are over. And I think that could have been true. I think the fact that there was a pretty robust response, and not only sanctions, but also arming the Ukrainians and, assisting them in their response, has been really important in kind of reaffirming this commitment of the world to the prohibition on force, and particularly the rejection of wars of conquest, in a way that I think revives that central prohibition and reminds us why it matters so much. A reminder that, we may have been kind of taking it for granted for a really long time and sort of been willing to kind of test it and maybe let it atrophy a bit. And this is a reminder that, we can't do that because so much else depends on the prohibition on war and the willingness of states to stand up for it. So I do think, in a way, perversely, this challenge to that fundamental principle of the international order may, in the end, and again, we don't know where this is going to end up, but may in the end have the effect of actually reviving it to some degree. How long that will last and how effective it will be, still to be seen. But the response, I think, has been inspiring and encouraging, and at least makes me believe that there's still a significant commitment to these norms and to the fundamental principles of the modern international order.
Let's talk about sanctions. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people said that sanctions don't work and sanctions harm the most vulnerable populations globally. after the United States and Europe and a few other countries imposed unprecedented sanctions, especially on Russian central bank assets. There was a lot of optimism in March and April of 2022 about the Russian economy collapsing, which hasn't exactly happened in the way that some people predicted, which leads me to ask, has anything changed with respect to sanctions, right? Are these sanctions just hurting the globally marginalized, and yet once again for the United States, as we saw in Iran, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Cuba, we've imposed sanctions and not made the progress that we hope to make. I'll turn that over to you, Paul.
Yeah, and this is another big question. I mean, I could go back to the previous question. There's so much we could talk about here, but I'll keep it focused on the sanctions to say that there's really several points I think are worth making about the sanctions. And the first one is that these are not, despite the fact that they appear unprecedented in scale, they're not universal. And we even talked about that, right? It is very much, if you just look at the map, it almost looks like a Cold War map. If you look at a map of which countries are imposing the sanctions against Russia and which ones are just not participating in that, or even taking advantage of the situation, such as China or India taking advantage of it to say, well, sure, we'll continue to buy your gas at a discount. So that's one thing that I think is very important to keep in mind when trying to determine the effectiveness of the sanctions, is that these are, but they are absolutely not universal, even though it at first seemed that way and we heard rhetoric along those lines. The second thing that they point to is the fact that sanctions at their core, and this is the key thing to keep in mind, and I've been following this and it's still unclear. We're now starting to enter the key test for it, but the key thing is that sanctions are about self-harm. And up until now, we haven't yet seen the harm that these sanctions can do on the countries that are imposing it. But now that we're entering the winter, this is going to be a big part. This is something that I feel like Putin has always had on his mind, that I can just hold out until things get really difficult and they're going to need Russian gas. If you're going to continue to see, say, situations of economic harm, this is why I felt that last week, the elections here in the United States were actually kind of a key test. Because if it was a situation where inflation and economic hardships ended up leading to, say, a rout for the Democrats here, that could be very foreboding for Biden in 2024. And that would be the kind of thing that Putin would then hope could be replicated in other countries, that the economic hardship caused by a slowdown in the global economy due to these sanctions could in turn have this political blowback. Now, we haven't seen that yet. We didn't see it happen. And part of that was because at the same time that the Biden administration was taking measures to help create this sanctions regime, they were also taking measures to help try to mitigate the economic harm at home. And that was very shrewd diplomacy, politics on the part of the Biden administration. Will all governments that are part of this sanctions regime do that same thing? That's going to be key because, again, sanctions are about self-harm. And I've always felt that one of the key questions for this war was which hourglass was going to run out first, if you will. The first hourglass being, how long does it take for these sanctions to actually stop the Russian war machine, which you could argue is what they're geared towards, or how long until the international coalition of sanctions that's been created breaks apart due to this self-harm and due to then the domestic political blowback from that. So I think those are the key things that I've been thinking about with it. And so these sanctions both illustrate how they can be effective, but they also illustrate why so much of that literature has talked about them being ineffective. It's because unless they are truly universal in nature, which is very hard to do with a major power like Russia, and I'm willing to call them a major power. I know some people say, well, they're not really, but I'm willing to call them that. It's very hard to do that in this case. And it's because of that self-harm aspect. So that's a key thing that I think about. There's more I could say on this, but I don't, I'll see if there's other things that we can talk about on the sanctions.
Can I add one thing?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. Can I add one thing on sanctions just real quick? I think that, in many ways, the events of this year have been really a spur for innovation in the international law community. And I mean, at least in sanctions, and I think Paul was getting at it very well in this tension, there has been an incredible amount of innovation trying to get that balance right, move beyond the impacts on, innocent populations, really focusing on the oligarch assets, the asset hunters, yacht hunters, this extremely targeted stuff. I don't know to what extent that is really kind of particular to the socioeconomic structure of the regime in Russia and the way in which it's squirreled away assets. But there may be lessons for the international community there that are more broadly applicable in terms of the fight against corruption and other drivers of conflict.
I just wanted to push you a little bit on your answer, Paul, because on the one hand, you say it's going to depend on, can the sanctions coalition hold? Is Europe willing to have the cold winter? Are they willing to turn the thermostats down? The U.S. elections. On the other hand, you paint a pretty, let's suppose all that holds, right? All those sanctions remain in place. You paint a picture that suggests that they still won't work, right? Because there are enough alternative ways. Or is that not? I mean, you point out very well that Russia has alternative markets, and they're large alternative markets that aren't going anywhere. So does the future of the sanctions really depend on whether the coalition stays together, or are they just very unlikely to actually succeed in any case?
It's a great question. And I would say that there's some respects that the harm that can be done to Russia is very much mitigated, and it doesn't matter about the ability of the coalition to hold together. And that's to your point. And that would be the fact that Russia does have access to these alternative sources of selling their gas and oil, for example. Having said that, there is a lot, and this is where the war machine aspect comes in, because this has always been one key question about the sanctions: is what is the goal of the sanctions, right? That's always been one key aspect. Was it A, to just be appearing to do something because you have nothing else that you can do because you don't want to escalate this war to World War III? Is it B, to punish Russia, to force them to leave, to change their behavior? Or is it C, to actually degrade the Russian war machine? And I think that with respect to the first two, that is where Russia's alternatives can be helpful, because it can allow them to continue to sustain the punishment that can be done by this. But the third one is really critical. It's not clear that Russia can actually sustain its war machine if these sanctions continue in the way that they continue. And that's really the open question. They could be able to seek out alternatives, but the alternatives are not necessarily to the level of what they could achieve if they still had access to, say, Western technology and armaments and so forth. And this is actually something that a lot of folks are following very carefully, like what are Russia's armaments levels compared to Ukraine's, and can they actually replenish those? So it's that third one where I think that the ability of the sanctions regime to hold together is very critical. But if it is just about punishing, and it's just about changing behavior, then I think in that case, it's going to be questionable about whether you need to hold that together, because Russia has alternative sources of just revenue. Putin has alternative ways of making sure that he can continue to have revenue. So I think that's the key: is what is the goal of the sanctions and how quickly can it achieve those goals?
Oops. Ona, do you want in quickly on sanctions?
Yeah, just a quick, I just want to agree with that, and also note that a lot of the sanctions, I mean, there is exactly this problem that Paul has pointed out, which is this dilemma with sanctions, that for sanctions to be effective, they actually harm both parties, right? I mean, this is the problem that we're running into, particularly with energy-based sanctions. But there's also been an effort to try and do an end run around that problem, or try to address that problem through sanctioning, through sort of slow burn sanctions, and through sanctioning technology, sources of technology that are sort of uniquely available from the West, so drilling technology that would allow Russia to reach certain kinds of some of the oil and gas reserves that really can only be reached through Western technology and techniques. And so those are things that are not going to be felt immediately, but have a kind of long-term effect. Also, parts for airplanes, other things that like over time are going to accumulate and have significant effect, but are not the sort of thing that's sort of like going to have the effect right now. So I think, what we're watching is these kind of energy sanctions, but I think a lot of the game is much more kind of long-term, slow burn sanctions that could have more of an effect over time. But I think another aspect of this that I just think is worth highlighting is that we're now, I think we knew before, but I think we're aware of it more, maybe in a new way, the vulnerability the reliance on sanctions creates for everybody. And what I'm interested to watch is the degree to which this leads to kind of fracturing of the global economy and loss of confidence in the kind of what was, at least for the international elite, kind of general confidence that more free trade is always better, and the more that you trade, the better, and the more we take advantage of comparative advantage, the better, and the bigger the markets, the better. And I think there's now more awareness of the fact that sometimes you may not want to be reliant on certain trading partners, and that you might want to be more, even if it's cheapest to get certain kinds of goods and from certain countries, that may still not be in your best interests. And I think more strategic awareness of the vulnerabilities that reliance on certain kinds of trading sources creates. And I don't know to what extent that will reshape the global economy, but we're already seeing some of that, just, as we're seeing the kind of reducing reliance of Europe, not complete end of reliance, but reducing reliance on energy resources from Russia, more awareness of kind of the vulnerabilities of excessive reliance on Chinese trade. And I think it's going to be interesting to see to what extent we kind of see these new trade blocs form, in part as a result of this awareness, and that will probably dilute the power of sanctions over time. And so we may have to think about ways to adjust to that new reality.
Yes, thank you, Ona. And I would say that's that's a trend that was well visible before 2020. We already saw in the technology sector, we already saw in global supply chains, we saw countries using security increasingly frequently as a way of opting out of global trade networks. And I share the sense that those might be a set of changes that have simply been accelerated or enhanced. But that leads to my next question, which I'm going to direct to Steve. And that, a lot of the ways that we've talked about the impact of the invasion leads to the suggestion that we are having a more globally bifurcated order, to use Ona's phrase. Whether we take the UN General Assembly votes in which China and India and a handful of other very powerful and important countries abstained from condemning the invasion, to the sanctions, which are also bifurcated in some senses, and even the growth in that you mentioned in the beginning of your remarks, the growth in regional organizations like NATO and EU. Isn't that just part of a decline in in global institutions from the WTO? And doesn't this invasion mark really the end of the significance of the UN Security Council? Not to be too negative about that, but so I'd be very curious on your thoughts on multilateralism, and especially global trends going forward, Steve.
Okay, no, I mean, I guess what I was saying before that this has been a spur for innovation in some ways, and I think it's also been a wake-up call for multilateralism, precisely to attempt to avoid that cleavage that we've been talking about here. I mean, one, I think it was a wake-up call also to the United States, in the sense that exactly the reactions by say African states in the UN Security Council that Nisha was referencing in her opening remarks. That was quite a wake-up call, and I think that there was a real effort to pivot and try to create cross-regional coalitions that were a little bit different than what I think at least the US or say Western countries had used in the past. And so one area that I wanted to just highlight, because it relates a little bit to sanctions as well, is kind of the renewed prominence of this issue of food security in the UN. And we know, just in the news yesterday, that the UN's grain deal that it had done with Turkey and Russia and Ukraine to allow grain to be shipped out. in a way, that is an indicator, I think, of, well, it's first very innovative. It's something that I think the UN has never really kind of done before, literally brokering these kind of like maritime movements and whatnot. That was very innovative for the UN. They were able to draw on a number of UN bodies that I think hadn't been involved in that kind of stuff before. So that to me augurs towards against the notion of total bifurcation of the United Nations system. In that I think Russia's invasion really was a wake-up call that we had to build broader coalitions. You're talking about the abstentions in the GA votes. I mean, I don't know. I think that the statistic that I always look at is kind of the just incredibly paltry number of no votes on these resolutions. You know, that how utterly isolated Russia is, you know, and the abstention is kind of a tool that can indicate some level of disapproval, but it might be the sort of you know, flexibility that is needed to bring countries on board. And we'll have to see how that evolves. I'm not sure that I would agree that the Security Council is it's certainly incredibly paralyzed. I'm not sure this is sort of the death of the Security Council or its kind of end. If anything, this crisis has shown, you know, some of the more traditional areas in which the Security Council has been important, namely kind of being a kind of a forum to draw global attention. You know, you can talk about like the G7 meetings, NATO, OSCE, G20. They don't get the same kind of global political attention that raising something in the Security Council does. Security Council members were also able to basically invoke this, you know, this uniting for peace procedure to send the situation to the General Assembly, which I think was, you know, not really used for such a long time, and it's something that I really never ever thought would be actually used in my career. In terms of innovations, you know, within the UN, you know, I think that the Russia's invasion allowed the P3, the US, the UK, and France to join this Liechtenstein initiative, which says that every time something is vetoed in the Security Council, the country has to go explain that in the General Assembly. That would have been anathema. I can't imagine the US would have agreed to that but for this. And there have been other little things like that in the UN that I think might help preserve the UN as a global institution and not a bifurcated institution. But I think I agree with the people in the panel that we have to kind of keep that under advisement and sort of see and also think about what international law can do, you know, as perhaps the only universal language, if you will, that can actually help prevent that kind of cleavage from happening.
Thank you. Let's pivot then really quickly to international criminal law. International criminal mechanisms have been very frequently discussed here in particular, to punish a variety of unlawful actions by Russia and by Putin in particular. And, you know, before the Russian invasion, I think it's fair to say that, you know, the International Criminal Court itself had not been joined by many of the world's most powerful countries, including the United States, China, and a long list. Most international criminal cases, whether brought in the ICC or brought in domestic courts under universal jurisdiction, were cases brought against people from Africa, and maybe that now includes North Africa with Syria. But there is a very regional sense in terms of how international criminal law is actually deployed, which I do think calls into question a variety of things about how universal it actually is. And so my question is, are we going to see international criminal mechanisms used to punish war criminals in this war? And if so, is that just going to be, and if the United States supports that, is that just another example of US hypocrisy, unwilling to actually support international criminal norms in any situation in which it actually serves our geopolitical interests? And then we will no doubt step back once it's not Putin, but once it is a US president who might run afoul of the prohibition on aggression. Steve, I know you do work on international criminal law. I'll start there. I'll start with you on that one.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, the advances, I think, in the U.S. posture towards, for example, the ICC that have occurred kind of over the course of the past year and a half have been pretty remarkable, if not incredibly trumpeted in terms of public opinion, or in terms of the public audiences. So sometimes it requires a little bit of close observation. I mean, of course, the Biden administration came in wanting to undo the really inappropriate and wrong approach that the Trump administration had towards sanctioning the ICC, and to kind of put the U.S. back into a more normal position vis-a-vis the ICC. And that includes, being a real leader on cases like Darfur, which is really, and actually the trial has started at the ICC this year. I couldn't have expected kind of the interest in Washington in terms of really cooperating with the ICC and allies and partners on the Ukraine issue, before February of 2022, including the fact that you now have, a resolution by Senator Graham and various other Republicans in the Senate calling for U.S. cooperation with the ICC, which is really a big change considering just the history of the ICC issue in the U.S. Senate. And just the efforts that I think the U.S. is making together with the EU, UK, and other states to try to work together and actually cooperate with the ICC. Of course, there are a lot of obstacles there. This issue of what implications will that have towards the issue that you raise, very rightly, Ingrid, which is this perception of hypocrisy. How much of the whatever changes happen going forward in the U.S. posture towards the ICC. I mean, what posture will that have on that overall issue? I'm not really sure, and I think that we should create the space to see to try to make it kind of as easy as possible for this cooperation to happen, because I think it might have second order knock-on effects. Like, who would have expected Senator Graham to bring that resolution, right? Who would have expected that to happen? And so I don't know. I think that we are seeing, and hopefully it's something that can be institutionalized and sustained going forward, regardless of whatever happens in U.S. politics into the future, that we can really be looking at a different era of U.S. posture that actually will also help mitigate some of these concerns that you're talking about.
Sadly, the hour has gone very quickly, and I'm going to turn to each of you to wrap up and look ahead, follow up on any points that you wanted to make that perhaps you didn't have the chance to do, but also, what will this war look like 5 or 10 years from now? What will we look back and say, wow, that really changed? It was one way before, and now it's totally different after. So Nisha, I'll start with you.
So, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what's going to happen and how this war is going to end. And 2 months ago, if you had asked me, I would have said that a kind of frozen conflict outcome is going to be most likely. And I still think that's probably the most likely outcome, although the percentage I would assign to it is a little bit lower today than it would have been 2 months ago. I think the borders are going to look slightly different given recent Ukrainian advances. But for me, the big question is, what are the domestic political implications for Putin if there are continued military advances by the Ukrainians, and then how those constraints or those conditions, how those affect his future decision making? In other words, what's he going to do if he's even more backed into a corner? But if we think about this in terms of the future of international law, I mean, I think that, for me, it's important to think about the fact that there are lots of opportunities here for China, India, African countries as a bloc, and also the US, and it's in the interests of a lot of these countries like China and India to take a stand against territorial aggression on the one hand, but also to retain flexibility with respect to their own territorial claims on the other. So I think the thought I would maybe just leave us with is that the US is done with its territorial conquests. these other countries, their international borders are much less settled. And I think that should really inform our understanding and expectations of what happens next in terms of what their relationship to these norms and laws will be.
Thank you so much. Steve?
Well, just very briefly, I mean, international law is clearly going to play part of the future of, what the future situation that we have in Russia and Ukraine. I mean, including because we have proceedings that have been launched by Ukraine in many different fora. We have already the kind of bones of some legal elements, like the General Assembly's recent resolution to call for the creation of a registry of damages that would relate to potential, claims and future reparations claims. I mean, international law has really been central to the international community's response. So I think it's going to need to be central to the way in which, the situation there settles, and be that in terms of criminal accountability, in terms of the kind of claims type angle, or in terms of sending a broader message about international law and international institutions. I mean, I think it's in some ways it puts international law more in the forefront of our minds. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a link in the chat to the American Journal of International Law's print agora on Ukraine, and also to our Unbound Symposium. Lots of work on sanctions, international criminal law, international organizations, use of force, trade, energy, and so on. Ona, I will turn to you next to sum up.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the early days, the conflict, I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs called International Law Goes to War in Ukraine, and where I sort of ran through, even in those early days, sort of the number of ways in which international institutions were already responding to the conflict. And that's only become more robust since. I think in a way, what's striking to me about these events is that what could have been the death knell for the international order might actually end up being, in a way, it's saving grace, because the way in which the world has come together and responded to this challenge has kind of reinvigorated institutions that had long been sort of atrophying. At NATO, the ICC, UNGA, I mean, there's you can name them, you can run through them, and so that could change, right? I mean, that could change as this conflict wears on, and interest in supporting Ukraine wanes. That could shift, but at least for now, I think it's actually the response of international institutions has been inspiring, and it's actually helped remind us what matters in international law and how important this fundamental prohibition on war is. And states have come together around that, and I think that's at least a hopeful message of this conflict.
Thank you so much. And Paul, you have the final closing remarks here.
Oh wow, that's a big task here with the panel that I'm on. But I mean, I agree a lot with what was just said. For me, when thinking about what will this war mean 5 years from now, a decade from now, first of all, let's hope that the war is still not going on 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I've been on record for saying that, and it goes to Nisha's point about a frozen conflict, I am still concerned that this could become an Iran-Iraq type war, but in Europe. And of course, remember, that was an 8-year war, very devastating war. And there's still, I think the most likely scenario, though I agree with Nisha, the probability is lower now, is something like that. So there's a good chance that we'll still be looking at this war that over that time frame. For me, if I want to tie this back to the notion of international law, and this will, of course, I think reveal a little bit of my perspective as an international relations scholar versus, say, an international lawyer, is I think that this actually shows the power of international law, and in particular, the UN Security Council, but maybe not in the way that a lot of other folks think about it. For me, if we focus on like the UN Security Council, I view it as its main goal. And indeed, you could say the main goal of international law as a whole has been to prevent major power war, not necessarily war as a whole, not necessarily interventions, not conflict, but to prevent major power war. And we're seeing that countries the countries involved are actually taking a lot of steps through legal systems, through other systems, to actually avoid that, including using the UN Security Council to ensure that there's not a major power war directly between NATO and Russia. And so if anything, this points to the power of international law if we think about it in terms of maybe not having universal ambitions, but having a very important goal, which is the prevention of major power war. And my hope is that even if this war does continue over a year, another year, it will continue in the way that it is, not where it's escalated to the level of major power war. And if that's happened, then I think you could say that this actually shows the power of international law.
All right, thank you. I know our panelists have other obligations and we need to conclude right on the hour. Thank you all so much. I learned a tremendous amount, and this was absolutely wonderful. And thank you, Cambridge University Press, and thank you for ASIL support staff and Cambridge University Press people behind the scenes who have worked hard to make this possible. Thank you so much. And with that, we are concluded.